Yeah, hello everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture. Today is the 9th session of our globalization module. From the previous session, we have discussed the nature of globalization from 3 different perspectives: international political economy, international security, and transnational society. We have analyzed the role of 3 different actors in the study of IR. Those are state, market, and society in shaping and reshaping globalization, and how, on the other hand, globalization has pushed us to reconstruct our conceptual understanding of what is state, what is market, and society. So today we are going to talk about contemporary globalization. So contemporary, in a sense of like current, present, now, in which case, like it or not, we will need to heavily consider the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, this pandemic has changed the structure of world order and has shifted the priority of states and market and society, has heavily influenced the dynamics of transplanetary connections between actors. It is interesting to know how it provides challenges and opportunities for globalization, which in the end defines the character of the so-called contemporary globalizations. Yeah. To discuss this topic, we are honored to have the presence of our guest lecturer, Professor Aart Scholte. Good morning, Professor Scholte. Professor Scholte, whose term transplanetary connections I referred to before, currently is the chair of Global Transformations and Governance Challenges Initiative at Leiden University. Professor Scholte has been scrutinizing the term globalization for ages now, link it to various other IR concepts, including hegemony, democracy, identities, civil society, and global governance. It is through his work on global civil society that I first knew him 15 years ago and started to admire and follow his work. And it is because of him I applied for a PhD program at University of Warwick, wishing to have Professor Scholte as my supervisor. Unfortunately, the month I sent him my research proposal was his last month being at Warwick before leaving for a new assignment at Gothenburg University, Sweden. So I was so unlucky at that time. But today, Professor Scholte, to share a session with you is like a dream come true with me. Dreams come true for me. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation and allocating time to be with us today. It's really a great honor. Thank you. Okay, so before passing the forum to Professor Scholte, I would like to quickly talk about some technical matters. Yeah, first of all, this is how all the session will run. First, we're going to hear from Professor Scholte, the lecture, and then we're going to have like a session for discussion between Professor Scholte and 13 panelists in panelist room. And then after that, we would like to hear from you. So please post your question in the chat box. You can do it starting from now. I will then read your question. I might also invite some of you to deliver your question in person. So we will unmute for your mic for you to be able to do so. Yeah. Secondly, a recorded version of this lecture will be available after this at YouTube channel of IR Department Universitas Indonesia. So you can keep coming back and learn about what is contemporary globalization later through our YouTube channel. Okay, without further ado, I would like to now invite Professor Scholte to deliver your lecture. The floor is yours, Professor Scholte. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Sundrijo, and thank you, Riris. It is nice to meet you at last. As you say, we had correspondence many years ago. We missed each other in Warwick, but now we find each other in cyberspace. So it's very nice to be here, and thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope you can send me some Indonesian warmth. I'm in the Netherlands. November. It's extremely foggy outside. I'm looking out the window. I can see maybe 10 meters in front of me. I hope that my lecture will be a little bit more clear than the mist that's outside here. Let's try and share the screen. Can I find the right one? There. Universitas Indonesia. Are you seeing something?
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
Good. Okay, here we go then. Understanding contemporary globalization. Right, in 2 hours. Now, globalization is understood very differently in different contexts, from different theories, from different parts of the world, from different parts of society. The one thing I would like to say, I'm going to give you thoughts on globalization from my perspective. I'm also very interested to hear about your perspective. So if, as we're going along, you have a thought, you have a question, you have a comment, you have a challenge, please jump in. It's nice then to have a little bit of an interaction too, because otherwise it's so alienating to give a lecture on the internet. I tell you, you feel like you're talking to the blindest. I'm very glad that some of you have your photos on at least. I have a feeling that I'm talking to some real people, even if they are two-dimensional. I'm going to talk about the global, my understanding of the global and globalization, talk a little bit about some of the remarkable global transformations in today's contemporary world, then talk about the governance challenges, about how we meet those global transformations. But let me first take a big step back. I know you have been looking at globalization from international political economy, international security, and international society perspectives. I want to throw in a little bit of historical anthropology to start off with. I want you to look at this slide and tell me what you think it is.
What is that?
Yeah, it's a trick question. Of course, you'll never come to what. But I want to tell you that this is a map of the world.
Wow.
It's a map of the world that comes from pre-colonial, what today we would call North America, what we would today call the state of New Mexico within the United States of America. This map of the world was found there, and it dates from the pre-Columbian time, so before the European settlers arrived. Mm-hmm. And this is the map of the world as those native peoples of that part of the world saw it. Here in the middle is their community, and descending on the community from the four corners of the map are the forces of history. Now you might be wondering, why am I showing you something like this? Well, let's move a little bit forward in history to the medieval times. Now I ask you to tell me, what do you see here?
It's a globe.
It's a globe. It's a globe. It's indeed a globe, but if you could look at it closely, what would be on this globe? Yeah, again, the picture is not clear enough, but I'll tell you what's on this globe. On this globe are mapped the stars, the constellations, because in medieval times, the globe was used to map the skies, not the earth. And you would turn the globe in order to see how the skies looked at different times in the year.
Interesting.
So again, the globe was a way of mapping something, but it wasn't actually to map the territorial terrestrial planet, it was to map the skies. Mm-hmm. If you move to the 16th, 17th century, you get an interesting transition. This is a pair of globes that I've encountered in Ecuador, actually. And what you have is, on the right side, you have a globe that shows the constellations. And on the left side, you have a globe that shows the continents. Yeah. And you begin to see that in this early modern moment, people are shifting their ideas of the globe to become the terrestrial planetary world. And here too, you begin to see this is actually also from Latin America, colonial Latin America, this picture. And you see that the painter is actually depicting a globe and has Europeans, Native Americans, Asians, and Africans This is their depiction. They are imagining. They are sitting in South America. They don't know what all these people necessarily look like. But what is interesting, they have a global imagination. This is before airplanes. This is before internet and so on. But they are imagining, here, look at this round globe as global. Why it's wrapped by a serpent, I don't know. Maybe that tells us that the world is not always a happy place. But you can see they are beginning to think of a global world. And finally, I take you here, and in fact, I probably take you to your own school. This is a picture that I took outside of a school in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And you see the 6-7-year-old children, they are entering the school, and outside of the school, they are being socialized. Every day they are walking into the school and they are seeing Ramani ya Dunia, map of the world in Swahili, and they are given this picture of the map of the world. In a way, they are seeing this map of the world, a global world, which is very different from this map of the world that was seen in another historical and cultural time. As I say, what I just want to have you think about for a moment is that globalization and a global world is a very historically specific experience. It's something that is modern, and it's something that has become especially acute in our contemporary time. If I say to you, the world, you do not see this. When I say the world, your mind sees this. So you are global. If the world is the large environment within which you live, then for you, the large environment within which you live socially is the global world. And globalization is the process, in a way, which has taken you from, or has taken us as people, from a situation where we imagined the world in other ways to the position where we imagine the world in this way. And now if I show you this map, it makes it's obvious to you. When I showed you this map, it was not obvious to you. But if I showed this map to the people who have this map, it would also not make sense to them. But anyway, this is just to historicize a little bit the global moment, which is turning out to be a rather long moment. Okay, what is the global here? We're talking about global scale, worldwide, transplanetary connections. On the one hand, a global transformation or a global condition is something that is observed across regions, across seas, across continents, across the planet as a whole. So we might say, you know, there's global warming. So we see it all over the planet. The global internet, we see it all over the planet. Global financial markets, they connect financial markets all over the planet. Global wars and global weapons, because they are flying from one side of the planet to another. So we can observe and describe global things. But I would also say global and global transformations, they also have dynamics that are within those transplanetary connections. So it's not just something that you observe and see. It's not, the global is not just where some things are happening, but it's also got an explanatory extent because the dynamics are in that area. So global warming, for example, is not just something that is observed across the planet. It also has causes. The global connections actually have impacts. They're not passive. The global, in the first place, for me, is about space. And it's about geography. That's why we were looking at the maps a moment ago. Globality resonates in the first instance of space and a social geography. It tells you about a where. It tells you about a location, a sphere, a place, a domain, where we live. We live in localities, Jakarta or Den Haag, where I'm sitting myself at the moment. We live in countries, Indonesia, Netherlands, and others. We live in regions, Southeast Asia, Europe, but we also live in the globe. We also live in the globe. We also live in a planetary space. In fact, our lives are multi-layered. One could even say trans-scalar. because we live in situations which involve a mix of local, national, regional, and global circumstances. Mm-hmm. I always used to get very irritated before I wrote this book on global and globalization, that people would define in the 1990s, they would often define global by global. So they would say, globalization is the process of becoming more global. And I thought, well, that doesn't help me very much. So what would be another word for global? And as you probably noticed if you read some of my other things, for me, global is not the same thing as international. International is international, between countries, between nations, between states. But an international way of thinking assumes that the world is divided into nation-state countries, and those nation-state country societies then have relations between each other. But global, for me, is a space onto its own. Yeah, it doesn't refer to another space. International refers to the national as the main space. But global is a space unto its own right. It's a planetary space. So in trying to find, rather than define global by global, define global by planetary or indeed transplanetary, across the planet. So global relations are links between people wherever on Earth they might be located on the planet. The internet has global transplanetary connections. We are, me in the Hague, you in Jakarta, maybe some of you are also listening from other places, wherever they might be. We can connect instantaneously, simultaneously within a planetary space. And we have a transplanetary connection, in this case through the internet. So for me, globalization is a rise in transplanetary social connectivity. Social, between people. Connectivity, links. Transplanetary, across the planet. Meaning planetary, planet Earth, in this case. Yeah, not interplanetary, that's maybe for another day.
Will that happen?
Yeah, well then we'll need a new book that won't be about globalization. Yes. It will be about solar systemization or something like that. Who knows? Okay, but here, so for me, and I keep saying for me because I know that you might have a different idea about globalization, and that's completely allowed. The definitions aren't authoritarian. But for me, when I think about globalization, what makes most sense to me is that it involves a geography whereby people increasingly have direct, and in many cases also instant links with one another wherever on Earth they might be located. And we see that, as I said earlier, in so many areas: ecological, global warming, biodiversity loss, ozone layer depletion. We see it militarily, in weapons, in world wars, and so on. We see it politically in governance arrangements, United Nations, and we'll talk about many others later on. We see it culturally in Olympic Games and in music that is crossing the planet, films, a global film industry, and so on. Anyway, we have all the different dimensions of social life have this global character in contemporary society.
Can I ask one question, please?
Sure.
Yeah, we have this discussion a couple of weeks ago in our class, and it's a long debate, talking about whether globalization is optional or not. Can we make a decision not to be part of it?
Yeah, well, in contemporary conditions, in many ways we cannot. You could decide to turn off the internet, the global internet connections. And in certain countries, there have been thoughts to do that. In fact, the Russian Duma has recently, a year ago or so, passed legislation to create a RUNet, a Russia net instead of an internet. And it's supposed to give Russia the possibility to disconnect from the global internet in the case of a war or in the case of some other situation. But are they actually doing it? Well, it's not clear that technically it's possible, but what is certainly clear is that politically it's not possible. Mm-hmm. Because if the government were actually to implement this, they would have a riot, they would have a national riot on their hands. Because for all the population, they want to be connected to friends and family beyond Russia. They want to be able to do a Google search. They want to be, and so they will put up with many things from the Putin government, but they will not put up with getting cut off from the internet. So I think you could say, you know, in principle, you could disconnect. In principle, you could say, let's make all of our clothes within the country. In principle, you could say, let's only eat the food that comes within the country. I mean, in principle, you could do this. But in practice, the way that contemporary markets work, the way that contemporary links, identities work, and this is not to mention ecology. You want to disconnect from global warming? Well, you're welcome, but I'm afraid you'll have to go to the moon. You cannot refuse global ecological changes, much as certain world leaders seem to want to try. So anyway, I would say you can certainly manage and seek to direct global connectivity, and you might wish to restrict certain global connections because of wanting to defend certain economic conditions, cultural conditions, political conditions, ecological conditions. It's certainly possible. But a total disconnect, a total de-link, no. And I think if you really put to people, would you want a total de-link? Would you want to have only food from your locality, only clothes from your locality, only communications within your locality? I think if you put it to that extreme, most people would probably say no.
Yeah, yeah.
At that point, they're not deglobalization people anymore.
Yeah. One of our participants, Satrio Santoso, said that at the end of the day, we are global citizens, where we are responsible for our action for the future. What do you think? I mean, there is a new term of global citizens now.
Yeah. Well, if citizenship means the rights that you demand and the responsibilities that you execute as a member of a political community. Yeah, if citizen, not citizenship in terms of what passport you hold, but if the concept of citizenship means you are a member of a political community, and as a member of that political community, you demand certain rights and you accept certain responsibilities, then you could speak of people being global citizens today. You would say, that you regard yourself as having certain rights and also certain responsibilities within a planetary community of humanity. And I think many people would accept that up, to various degrees. Mm-hmm. If there's a humanitarian disaster somewhere, then people would say, it doesn't matter that they're in this country or this region or whatever, they are human beings suffering a disaster of some kind. I have a responsibility to have at least empathy and perhaps give material aid. That's a kind of global citizenship. So I would say that but is global citizenship overriding national citizenship? Is it stronger than, and does it overcome? Do people have a sense that the political community is the global humanity more than the nation? Do they feel equally that they have responsibilities towards a global community as they do towards a national community? Mm-hmm. I think there certainly there is more sense of global citizenship today than perhaps at an earlier time. Mm-hmm. But to say that it has replaced and taken over from national citizenship, mm-hmm. I think that would be a very strong point. I think people tend nowadays maybe to have different dimensions of citizenship. In the European Union, if you perhaps remember from your time studying here, there is also European Union citizenship. Mm-hmm. And my passport actually says, I now have a Swedish passport after the British decided to leave. So my Swedish passport says European Union on it. So I'm a citizen of the European Union as well as a citizen of Sweden. And then I might, in my heart, also say I'm a citizen of the world. I don't have a global passport yet.
Yeah.
Professor Scholte, sorry.
Yeah.
Your second conception of the global citizen, the one that overtake the national citizenship, is it like cosmopolitanism by Kant, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
cosmopolitanism is just like that. It didn't accept the concept of citizenship by the state, but a global citizenship. So cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Kant, so I don't want to go too far. But I don't think that Kant was denying national affiliations and so on, but was talking about that there should be hospitality to whatever peoples you might, a certain hospitality to whatever peoples you might encounter. So not all cosmopolitanism has to be universalism, I think. A sort of universalist humanism that sort of says, well, all people are one, all people are the same. There's a particular kind of liberal universalist cosmopolitanism that assumes that there's kind of one model of society, one set of values that encompasses everyone. But I think we can also think of cosmopolitanism in other ways. In more, if I might even call it post-colonial ways, because that kind of cosmopolitanism, that traditional liberal, I mean, one has to say modernist, West-centric, Eurocentric kind of cosmopolitanism was often saying, well, yes, we'll have a global universal world which will be like Europe. Thank you very much. And I think people, then there's been reactions to that kind of cosmopolitanism, but then often the reactions to that kind of cosmopolitanism have been very multiculturalist and communitarian, which are almost saying, you know, there is no possibility of global community and the like. We're all different. We should all go into our separate cultural corners and leave each other alone. But I think there are other cosmopolitanisms that could be much more transcultural, for example, rather and be not assimilationist and kind of imperialist in the sense of Western dominated and imposing, but be a cosmopolitanism where diversity and difference were in close connection with one another. You could still have a global community, but not everyone would have to be the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is one of my qualifications that I'll make about globalization a little bit later. One question that you haven't asked, which often comes up, is that people say, oh, yeah, you're talking about globalization and the contemporary world. We've had globalization for centuries. We've had it for ages. There's nothing new here. Look, there were colonial empires before. They were connecting the globe. Look, there were world religions have been connecting continents. Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and so on have been connecting people across long distances for centuries. The slave trade was moving between, and other trade routes were linking continents hundreds and hundreds of years ago. There's nothing new here. Yeah. And I wouldn't dispute that. But I would say that the amounts of global connections today are unprecedented. So I don't think you can say that the global flows of money and finance in earlier times, they were not of the scale, of the amount that we see today. They were much smaller. The scale of travel. Okay, right now we are in COVID pandemic, but you know, when we are not under pandemic, then the scale of travel and migration, if we include by migration also people moving temporarily, is far greater than we've ever seen. The internet connections, I mean, 30 years ago, there wasn't an internet even. And we moved from 100 million internet users in 1998 to 4.9 billion regular users of the internet today. don't tell me that, you know, there were internet connections 50 years ago. So certainly there are historical antecedents. There's a longer history of global connections, but the amounts of global connections today are something that we've never seen before. The range of global connections, meaning all the different types, ecological, psychological, economic, political, even we are even connected globally through time. There's a global time regime that told all of us that there are time zones, and now how many people do we have? I don't know, 400 people that are here. They all knew to come to this place on the Zoom at a particular time. Why? Because there's global coordination of time. So we have a range. Everything in our life, from time to economy to ecology, has a prominent global dimension. The regularity, the frequency with which we have global connections is much greater than ever before. The speed at which the global connections happen, with digital networks and the like, is far faster than it's ever been before. The intensity, the depth with which you experience global connections are far greater than ever before, and the impacts of global connections, the consequences, the implications are much greater than ever before. So I do think there's a reason why I and many other people started writing books about globalization in the late 20th and early 21st century. It wasn't because we wanted to support the ideology of the International Monetary Fund. It was, who was also talking about globalization at that time, but it was because there were these unprecedented global connections. And again, if you are now studying at the Universitas Indonesia, probably you are born since the 1990s. You don't know. You've only known a global world. You think that it's always been like this, but put a few gray hairs on my head, and you can go back to my birth in 1959, and I can tell you, in my youth, no internet, air travel was very, very rare. When I phoned my grandmother in 1962, we had to order a 3-minute slot on the transatlantic telephone cable 3 weeks in advance, and for that 3-minute call, it cost us 1/4 of the rent of the house for a month.
Wow.
You don't realize, if you were born since 1990, you don't realize what the world was before. So I think there is something here.
There is one question, I think, context to our question from the one of the participants is our student Mevita Dea. The question is, does your definition or your understanding of globalization actually include the experiences and ways of thinking of such remote groups as indigenous peoples in remote area? If so, where are they located in the globalization concept? How are their agencies, assuming multiplicity and multiscalarity, defined in the concept? So I think this question probably come up because you try to convince us that globalization is inevitable, right? But we know that there is a story of those in remote areas who probably now still live the way you live your life in 1959. I don't know how you going to.
Oh, I wish I could dig up. I have a photo. It's a very good question, and it's a very important question. Now, nearly 20 years ago, I was interested in questions of, and I'm still interested in questions of, democratizing global affairs. How do we make a contemporary global world? How do we govern it? How do we approach it? How do we shape it in ways that allow affected people to participate and control their destiny? And issues like indigenous peoples or other people who are marginalized, silenced in today's global world, I thought, okay, one needs to understand global democracy also from the perspective of, yes, people who are otherwise excluded. And so I went to speak with indigenous peoples in Amazonia in 2005 about views of the global and democratizing the global. And yes, there are some indigenous people who are very remote and relatively disconnected. They're still affected by climate change and the like, so they're not isolated from global relations, but certainly more remote. But I went to certain communities in Amazonia where they were in fact quite involved with global trade. They were making jewelry from nuts and seeds and on the forest floor, and they were making jewelry and then exporting that to Europe. They were speaking a global language, Portuguese, as well as their local languages. They were engaging with a global discourse. Indigeneity is a global discourse. It's kind of a paradox, but indigenous is a global discourse, and it's a global movement. And under this global category of indigenous, all kinds of peoples are now affiliating with one another across the planet, who never would have affiliated with each other before. And the United Nations actually has a special permanent has a permanent forum for indigenous issues. So if you go to the United Nations today, you see the one General Assembly of States, and you also see a permanent forum for indigenous issues where representatives of indigenous peoples from across the globe can meet and discuss. So this indigeneity is not, it's a different global, you could say, but it's not non-global. It's not, and well, sometimes it's actually part of the established conventional global, for example, when it's found at the United Nations system.
Okay.
But actually, picking up on another point there, when I met with these indigenous peoples in Amazonia, one of the interesting things, going back to the earlier question about citizenship, I mentioned the term citizenship in that conversation, and the people from the indigenous community there stopped me and said, "We don't believe in citizenship." The concept. They said citizenship is an idea of living in the city, and built into the concept of citizenship is a separation of human society from the wider web of life. And it means that people only think about their rights and responsibilities towards other human beings rather than towards the wider web of life. So we don't believe in citizenship. They had a term of florestania, living at one with the forest. Again, just to say, to that extent, there was an indigenous perspective on global relations, which was different from the prevailing dominant Eurocentric one.
Yeah.
But it's still global.
Yeah. I think there is, listening to your explanation and going through all the questions that we have in here so far, I can see that there is like a gap between two understanding of globalization. From the very beginning, you said globalization is about global consciousness, right? But we are at least we are. I said the word we as if I represent all the 455 participants. But yeah, allow me to do so as a moderator. We understand globalization more as mechanism, more as word structure, more as word order, as if it is something beyond us, something that is imposed to us. I don't know whether this is related to post-colonialism, how we see the world, right? But and because of that, I think it's not very easy for us to accept the idea that globalization is actually about global consciousness. What do you think about this?
Well, yes, but I think the form of that global consciousness can be multiple. The global consciousness that young people have can be quite different than the global consciousness that older people might have. The global consciousness that racially oppressed people might have would be different than the global consciousness that racially oppressive groups might have. The global consciousness that Muslims might have, I would consider the notion of the Ummah as a global consciousness. If you take the Ummah, then you say, I have an affinity, with all of those of Muslim faith, no matter where on the planet they might be. That's global consciousness. It's not the same global consciousness as a banker in the City of London, but it's also a global consciousness. So it seems to me that there are multiple global consciousnesses, and in fact, each of us in different moments of our lives, even in different moments of our day, will have different types of global consciousness shaping our life. And that, I don't think that's a problem. It just shows you the complexity of human existence.
And where is state in this constellation? I mean, you know, most of us here is IR academician, right? We used to the idea that state is the main actor.
Well, the state is conceived of as the main actor in traditional international relations theory. But as I said before, for me, international relations and global studies are not the same thing.
Yeah.
International relations in the sense of, if we accept that international relations is only about states, that's another debate. Others would include non-state actors as well. But let's just say that you accepted for a moment the interstate relations. The interstate relations are part of the global relations. Diplomacy is about global networks. And United Nations and other global intergovernmental organizations are a state dimension, an interstate dimension of global relations. So there's not international relations on one side and global relations on the other side. I would say no, international relations are part of global relations. But I think the problem for me comes if people start reducing world politics to international relations. And rather, world politics includes global relations as well as international relations. And those global relations involve states, national territorial governments, but they also involve other actors very prominently.
Yeah. Then, I mean, I'm looking for one of the question from the participant, Arslan Pahrudin. He mentioned something about inequality. He argues that globalization brings benefits more to powerful countries other than the others. So in this case, is actually globalization is his question is, so is it possible for globalization to bring equality? If yes, in what way? But I would like to dig more, link to the consciousness and also post-colonialism from where I came from. So if you say globalization is about global consciousness, is it the consciousness of the powerful, or is it really the consciousness of everyone?
Yeah, well, maybe take your question first, Rius. As I say, I think there are many global consciousnesses, and there are more dominant global consciousnesses, which tend to be inhabit the mass media much more, inhabit elite circles much more, inhabit certain parts of the world much more, and those are the dominant, the most powerful, you could call it hegemonic, perhaps, global consciousnesses. But at the same time, you can have global consciousness in global solidarities of indigenous peoples, as we've already discussed. You can have global solidarities amongst sexual minorities, global pride. You can have global consciousness within various religious faiths. You can have global consciousness amongst landless peasants. You know, there's a movement, La Via Campesina, which unites cultivators who are struggling with their land rights all across the planet. So there are counter-hegemonic global consciousnesses as well, is what I want to say. They're the hegemonic, but they're the counter-hegemonic, coming from religious faiths, from subordinated classes, subordinated races, various subordinated groups that are finding solidarity and power through their global linkages. They are in subordinate position. I'm not saying that there's any kind of equality here, not at all. But I'm saying global consciousness is not monopolized by the powerful. It can also be occupied and by the subordinated. In terms of inequality, yes, for sure. Some of the, if I can call it, neoliberal ideology of globalization, particularly in the late 20th century, promised that greater global connectivity was going to bring prosperity, peace, liberty, democracy, etc. to everyone, with the implication that somehow globalization was there for everyone to benefit from in some equal measure. And of course, we've seen that that's not the case at all. And that there are great political, economic, ecological, cultural inequalities that go hand in hand with contemporary globalization. Is inequality built into globalization? Does the fact that you have people connected all over the planet, does that mean by definition that there's going to be inequality like of this kind? This I would contest. I don't think that the vision of the Ummah, for example, is a vision of inequality. So there are visions of the global which do not involve inequality. Now the question is, how do you get there? This, of course, is very difficult, because a number of the forces, the persistent forces of colonialism, even though we don't have a world of formal colonial empires anymore, the neo-colonialisms continue. So structural neo-colonialism makes equality very difficult to achieve. Capitalism makes equality very difficult to achieve. Global capitalism is premised on surplus accumulation. Surplus accumulation means extracting surplus from some groups and into the hands of other groups. So, as long as capitalism is core to contemporary globalization, I think equality is not. It's going to be something that's very difficult to find. So. But the idea that you couldn't have a more equal globalization, that I would still contest. Just in the European context, there has been considerable more equality material, economic equality brought into many of the societies through the so-called welfare state. Where the forces of capitalism have been harnessed and tamed by state intervention of various kinds and taxes and so on to redistribute wealth in such a way that, although it's not equal, it's a lot more equal than it once was. You could, in principle, have global redistributive policies. You could have a global welfare state. In principle, I'm not saying that we have it or that it's around the corner, but you could have it in principle. You could have global redistributive taxes. You could tax global corporations. You could tax internet use. You could tax air travel. You could tax financial transactions in a progressive way, so that you took more resources from those who are materially advantaged and redistributed them to those who are materially less advantaged, but this time on a global scale rather than within a particular country. You could have that. Mm-hmm. Politically, it seems quite remote and difficult at the moment, but I would say to you in that regard, imagine yourself back in the year 1920. Go back 100 years. And imagine yourself, so here you are in 1920, it's a world of colonial empires, and it's a world of very liberal, unequal capitalism. Also in the global north, also in the colonial metropoles. And yet, 30 years later, you have decolonization across the planet, and you have the welfare state in many, many areas, and major redistribution achieved. Something that seemed inconceivable in 1920 had become obvious in 1950, 1960. So if we are living in 2020, and we are living in a world in which change happens much faster than it did 100 years ago, who's to say that we couldn't, within a limited number of years, bring about fundamental regulatory transformation that would create greater global equality? I'm not saying it's easy, I'm not saying it's obvious, but what I'm saying is I don't think it's as impossible as people often make it out to be.
Professor
People made inequality, greater equality, seem like it was impossible in 1920, and it didn't turn out to be impossible at all. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry. No, I just would like to intervene here. The notion that globalization creates inequality, maybe because stems from our understanding that globalization usually deal with capitalism. Big company expand their operation across the globe, and the transmultinational corporation, etc. So more on that economic sense of globalization that dominated by big powers from big countries. So I think this is why then a lot of people in Indonesia think globalization creates inequality. But from your explanation on the globalization, I think you are talking about globalization in much broader sense, more social context, and rather than only merely economic sense. So in that sense, you mentioned about the possibility of other global consciousness, etc. So I think this is the difference why we have that kind of question from the student just mentioned by Riris. That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think I also would often focus much of my work on the economic dimension. It just seems to me that the economic dimension is interrelated with the others. So you were mentioning yourself about, on the one hand, capitalism, but on the other hand, big powers. So, I mean, there's the economic domination, but there's the political domination, and they are interconnected. And I think I would add to that cultural domination and other dimensions, psychological domination. You know, domination is also a frame of mind. It's a way of experiencing life and so on. And that psychological domination comes because one is politically, economically, culturally dominated. But then it also feeds back in the whole thing. So I find inequality to be multidimensional, in which the different dimensions, cultural, economic, political, and others, are mutually reinforcing very often. In that way, I'm not an economic determinist. You know, I wouldn't say the economic inequality is first, and then the other inequalities are a consequence of that. For me, but this is not right or wrong. Yes, this is just a position. Other people are cultural determinists, and they think that values and ideas are the first thing, and the economic conditions and political conditions follow that. But in any case, in my case, I tend to look at an interplay of those. I wouldn't say that globalization creates inequality, economic or other. The inequalities were already there before contemporary globalization. Unless you want to say globalization goes back to the colonial empires and the like, and then you say, well, up until the early 19th century, the economic conditions across the world were relatively similar, and the divide, the inequality begins to grow from the late 18th, early 19th century, and that then gets wrapped up in colonialism and so on and so forth. Then you could say the inequality between world regions is bound up with a long-term globalization that goes back to colonialism, to modern colonialism. But contemporary globalization, I think, builds on inequalities that were already there. But what contemporary globalization has especially done is has increased the inequalities between a very small, super rich and the rest. So people in a number of social movements talk about the 1%. Mm-hmm. And what they mean is that in today's world, I think the latest figures I know of is 0.7% of the world's population controls 45.2% of the world's assets. Mm. And 50% of the world's population controls less than 1% of the world's assets. I mean, that's an extreme inequality, where a very small circle is controlling the vast, largest concentrations of resources, and the vast majority of humanity has almost nothing to its name. Now, that kind of inequality, that has been very particular, and the figures that I gave you there are coming from Credit Suisse wealth research department. It's not from some socialist party somewhere. No, this is the global banks. It's their own figures. So where the global banks might celebrate this kind of wealth accumulation, others are appalled.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I got thought of by the head of postgraduate program. She said that I talk too much, and I should actually give you opportunity to finish your lecture first before keep interrupting you. So, so is this? I mean, if you want to continue with your lecture, that's okay. But if you want to open for discussion, I mean, it's up to you.
I'm very happy to go. And look, it's your moment. I want to deliver whatever people are interested in. So I can do whatever. Okay. But yeah, there are some more slides, but keep asking questions. I think it's also interesting for people. It's more lively than when there's just a person talking all the time. Well, I was going to add a number of points that I've already mentioned here, that globalization is not new, but don't exaggerate that it's the same. Globalization is not about globalism. I don't think we should think that everything and anything has become totally global in today's world. Territory is still important. Some people say that globalization means that the territorial state, territorial identities, or territorial borders are not important anymore, and I think it's obvious that they are. Here, this is the wall between Israel and Palestine. Just to remember that borders in some parts of the world are very territorial borders are still very striking. Yeah, I'd mentioned earlier that the global doesn't exist by itself. It's always interrelated with local conditions and with national conditions, and with regional conditions. I've tried to point out and stress that for me, globalization is not the same as a Western universalization, but that in fact, there are many cultural globalizations. Some of them are more powerful than others, but the idea that globalization is removing and erasing cultural diversity and difference, I don't see any evidence of that at all. This is just the French language asserting its own alternative globalization. World Buddhist movement. This is the World Buddhist flag in Sri Lanka. But so there are cultural diversities. Uneven spread. I think you mentioned earlier, Riris, about certain remote communities that might not be as caught up in global connections as others. So not everybody is equally globalized, if you like. We've talked about the inequality, the unequal distribution of benefits and harms in today's global world. And largely because of those unequal distributions, there's a lot of political argument about the global world. Here was the 99%, which is what's left over after the 1%. This was from a protest in London, I think, some years ago. I also would say that for me, globalization is not predetermined. In other words, I don't think that we are on a set historical course, which has some predetermined endpoint. You know, some years ago, early 1990s, it was the end of the Cold War, and some excited authors, liberals, primarily in the United States especially, talked about the end of history. And that, you know, a sort of West-led, US-led globalization was going to make everybody in the world just like the liberal Western United States. And that was globalization was about, and that's where we were going. And as I say, that's not where I mean, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote this particular book about the end of history, that globalization was going to make the whole world in a US-led sort of Western model. Fukuyama himself has later said that this doesn't make sense. So we're not on a predetermined course. I challenge any of you to tell me what the global world is going to look like 30 years from now or 40 years from now. Because if I go back 30 years, 40 years, then I couldn't imagine the end of the Cold War. I couldn't imagine the internet. I couldn't imagine a global pandemic. And I couldn't imagine many of the other things that are dominating our lives today. So I challenge you to give me a precise prediction of what the global world is going to look like, especially looking at the students, you know, when you're my age. You're a brilliant predictor if you can do that.
Scott, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm very interested about your statement on predicting the future, but I see a lot of things happen around the world right now, especially in the terms of conflict, low intensity conflict. And I want to know your view about this statement. Do you agree that contemporary globalization increased separatism with the rise of separatist political parties and access given from global connection to support them? Will there be more of new country in the next decade? And globalization is the one who is responsible for that phenomenon.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, that's very interesting. I mean, I think I would go back to the earlier comment that things happen not only because of global forces, but also because they unfold because of the way that global forces intersect with national, local, regional circumstances. So we don't see separatism everywhere in the world, but we see it in certain places. And so I would say globalization is important in fueling that separatism to the extent that in a global world, the focus of identities on the national state is relatively, identities are still very strongly focused on the national state for many people. But there is more space in global politics for other identities, including subnational nations, if you like. And so, yes, we do see that there's more space in a global world for the assertion of Scottish or Catalonian separatism in Europe, or South Sudan in Africa, or yes, certain movements in Indonesia perhaps as well. Southern Philippines, Mindanao, and so on. So yes, there certainly are separatist politics, and globalization enables that in a number of ways. Will it increase? That's hard to say, because you have integrating processes within a global world as well. Regionalism is a primary example of that. On the one hand, you've got the separatisms that you're mentioning, but we also have the regionalisms, which are also very strong. I speak better from the European perspective that I'm living here in Europe myself, but within Europe, one sees the European Union as an integrative process. It has its setbacks, it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. and then there's the separatist movements at the same time in a number of locations across Europe. And these are coexisting, and sometimes they feed off each other. So Scottish separatism is actually fueled in some ways by the European Union, because the Scots feel that within the European Union, they're happier than within the United Kingdom. So the separatism and the regionalism kind of go hand in hand. It's a complex business.
Mm-hmm.
May I
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
May I ask one question again, Professor?
Sure.
More questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity, the International Relations Department. I'm going to genuinely ask about. I'm so fascinated by your explanation about the globalization that you explained from the historical context that in the 16th century, in the 17th century, you portray the globe itself in your explanation, that if we are now from the 21st and 22, maybe, and in the next century, if we see the globe itself that you have displayed is different, the way we define the global itself will be different, and maybe and the people that came from the previous and past century will be also seeing the globe, and the 21st century will be different in seeing the globe itself, as you have explained it to before. This is very much interesting and intriguing me to ask that, is it because that if the people around the world depends on their geographical state, it depends on their place, is going to define the word of the global is different, and yeah, is it because the geographical condition of the people will make people define the word of globe itself different, or yeah, it's just merely the context that the globe itself is a social construction, depends on the people live on where the people live in that place, or something like that. Is there any correlation and interdependence in that cases? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No. No, very good. Very interesting question. Yes, because you're right. There are conceptions of the global that you can take back to the 16th and 17th century, and then you can look at conceptions of the global up to today. But it's not like today is the end. So there are other conceptions of the global that will follow in the time to come. And it's very interesting what you kind of ask us to think about. What would those other conceptions of the global look like that we might be moving towards? And I'm thinking a little bit about that map of the world that I showed you earlier on, yes, where the children are sitting outside the school, and the global world for them is a map where all the countries and continents, but it's still a map of the world with countries and continents. It shows the global whole, but it's still the countries and continents. Now, suppose that you instead map the world in terms of internet connections. So then you didn't have a territorial backdrop, but you mapped the world in terms of the intensity of internet connections that people have with one another. Then that map probably wouldn't map onto a territorial map as at least neatly, and might show us quite different dimensions. You mentioned that the global is a geographical place and a geographical condition, but look. Part of the global condition at the moment is this lecture. We are having a virtual lecture. Our geography is a virtual space. As we are having this lecture, yes, of course, I am in a territorial place, you are in a territorial place, but what's most important in this lecture is not the territorial place. What's important is the internet connection. What's important is the virtual space that we're sharing, and which enables us to have conversations that are deterritorialized to some extent. Now, if we take, so some people are saying, we're in we're in a deglobalizing world because of the COVID pandemic. I don't think we're in a deglobalizing world at all. We're in a dephysicalizing world, maybe, where more and more of our connections are virtual and the like. But I don't know about you in Jakarta, but me here, I'm not having very many connections face-to-face with people locally, or nationally, or regionally, or so it's not about that the pandemic is deglobalizing things. No, it's as I say, physicalizing things. It's virtualizing things. So maybe that future global space is much more virtual and less bound to territorial coordinates. Let's see. Let's see. But thank you for the question. It tests my imagination.
Thank you very much too for your clear explanation, Professor.
Okay.
Professor, maybe one more question, or
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Just one take. According to your notion, does globalization actually speed up the democratization process, particularly in many countries?
Oh, that's a tricky one, isn't it? That's a very tricky question. If we look at the late 20th century and early 21st century, then we certainly see a spread of liberal national democracy to many countries. You know, increased political systems in which there are multiple parties competing in periodic elections to occupy state office. So, and Indonesia included. And if you looked at that trend and you said democracy means having liberal national regimes of multiple parties competing periodically in free and fair elections to representative institutions, if that is your definition of democracy, then maybe you would say, yes, in the last 30 years, there has been democratization. But at the same time, democracy, in my book anyway, means that affected people are able to have due participation and control over the decisions that shape their collective destiny. Yeah, affected people, and now let's think a moment, who are the affected people of global conditions? The affected people are not just Indonesians, or Bolivians, or Russians, or whatever. No, the affected people do not fall into territorial units. So what is the demos? What is the demos? What is the people when it comes to global affairs? If the demos means the affected people, the affected community, then the affected people of climate change, or the affected people of internet governance, or the affected people of financial markets, and so on, do not correspond to national populations confined to a particular territory ruled by a particular state. And indeed, that state, although it might claim legally to be sovereign, that state does not actually have absolute, comprehensive, supreme control over those global conditions. The Dutch state is not giving me, as a resident of the Netherlands, my due participation and control in climate politics, or so on. And I would modestly suggest the Indonesian state probably doesn't offer you the same, because nation states cannot offer us the due participation and control that we have as affected people within global affairs. I'm not saying do away with the nation state. I'm not saying do away with national elections and parliaments and so on. I'm not saying that they're useless. I'm just saying that they're not enough. They're not enough for democracy in a global world. And so on the one hand, yes, there has been a democratization during this period of globalization, in the sense that liberal modern democracy has spread within more countries. But at the same time, that globalization has taken a lot of control out of the hands of states. So the very institutions that you are electing are the institutions which are no longer able to control your situation. So you're having more democratic control over something that doesn't control it. And so there's a paradox there. On the one hand, there's democratization, but actually at the same time, there's a de-democratization. Now, don't ask me how to fix it, because then we'll be here for a long time.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, the operator of this Zoom asks whether you have finished with the PowerPoint. If you have finished, then probably we can stop the share screen so that the participants can see your voice. You can see your face directly, or is there any other thing you want to?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I could go on, but if you think that we better, if there are more questions, and you think that we will finish the time with questions, then I can certainly stop. I was going to talk about some more governance problems and so on, but actually the questions are making me say these things anyway. So I'm happy to take more questions, and then we can just stop the show.
Okay, but can we have your PowerPoint, and so we can probably. Okay. Okay.
Absolutely. I'll send it to you afterwards. But I can stop the screen now. Do you see me?
Yes, clearly. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. So colleagues at the panelist room, you still have questions? We have 10 minutes before we open the forum for the participants. If you still have questions or you want to give comments, idea, feedback to what Ian has mentioned, feel free. Otherwise, I will start reading the question from participants.
Okay. The questions from participants are in the chat, is it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, in the chat and in the question and answer box. Okay, I see Mbak Evi raising her hands. Is there any other panelists who want to ask questions? If not, then I give the opportunity. Okay, Farhan. Mbak Evi, can we give opportunity to Farhan first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Farhan, please.
Thank you, Mbak Evi and Professor. I would like to ask a question about globalization as a process. Is a globalization a process? And if it is a process, what is the limit or the finish line of globalization? And where it will stop? And to what extent the unit of today's world, like states, can endure and tolerate that limit of globalization? That's the question.
Okay, your voice was breaking up a little bit for me. I don't know about others. You were asking about whether there are limits to globalization?
Yes.
And in particular, what that meant for the state, or did I miss that?
No, he asked whether globalization is a process. If it is a process, when it starts, and where is the limit of that process?
Yeah. I think for me, it is a process in the sense of globalization is a process whereby transplanetary social connections become greater in quantity and in impact. So that's a process. Is that process, is its rate and is its direction determined? I think no. Does it have limits in the sense that it might turn around and become less? It's certainly conceivable. It's also possible that you might have more global connections in certain areas, less global connections in other areas. I mean, at the moment, you could say we are having less global connections in travel, air travel and the like, but we are having more global connections in terms of the virus, because the virus is spreading. We are having global virus, global infectious disease today much more than we were having a year ago. So you can have, in different dimensions, you can have speeding up and slowing down. My own view is that in general, I would be cautious about a comprehensive and permanent reduction of global connections in their totality within the foreseeable future. I don't see that people are living global consciousness. Capitalism is living through global connections. Ecological conditions are indelibly global at the moment. These things are not going to go away. We're not going to turn off 4.9 billion people from the internet. I just don't see it happening. So, I mean, that there is deglobalization in the sense that there is competition between states in the global economy, and states might be raising tariffs, or they might be using various interventions to restrict particular trade flows. Yeah, that certain states and countries might be limiting migration flows and the like. Yeah, but that's not deglobalization. That's, you know, interventions in the processes of globalization. And as far as the migration issue is concerned also, look demographically, look ahead in the next 30 years. During the next 30 years, certain parts of the world are going to age. The population profile is going to become much older. And in other parts of the world, the age profile is going to become much younger. The demographic logics are going to mean major migration. And, you know, I don't care what you know, various populist parties might be saying about anti-immigration and so on and so forth. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. And the question is, you know, how are people going to deal with it?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. One last question from panelists. Okay. Agung, no? Yeah. Mbak Evi, probably?
Yes.
Agung is coming in. I think, no, Agung has gone out again.
Okay. One last question, Mbak Evi. Or Agung. Agung, you want to say something?
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I love your presentation and your explanation towards the globalization. I would like to ask my question. My question is, what is your perspective towards globalization during pandemic era? What are the impacts from pandemic towards the globalization, whether it's in economy, social, and politics? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and it's especially tricky question because it's something that's going to happen fairly quickly. So you can write to me next month even and tell me I was wrong. So some of these other questions are about predicting 10 years or 20 years in the future, and by that time you will have forgotten about this lecture, so you won't remember that, you won't realize that I was wrong. But with this question, you know, what is the pandemic going to do to globalization? That's quite immediate. That's quite short. Well, my anticipation, and I might be wrong, but my anticipation is that once the vaccines and so on are in place, that the global travel and the global trade and that will not immediately go to previous levels, but will tend in that direction. Mm-hmm. I think that Riris would still like to do her Ph.D. at the University of Warwick. I think that I would still prefer to do this lecture with you in place in Jakarta than over this screen. I think that the global mobility of bodies, you know, which at the moment is restricted, I think that will resume. I think it's what people, but I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm suffering with all of this business, and so I don't see that now. Of course, there will be economic interruptions. There will be. It's a little bit like, you know, after there was no, I don't want to say that the global pandemic has been like a global war. It's not the same sort of thing. But after major wars, there have been major periods of rehabilitation and reconstruction of economic and other social connections. And I think that that will happen in this case as well. What do I hope might happen? Well, I'm not very optimistic, but I would hope that people would look at the experience of this pandemic and say, our existing processes of global cooperation are sadly lacking. So if we look at how there has been response to this pandemic in terms of the World Health Organization and other global cooperative mechanisms, they've been very lacking. And that you see that major states, including the United States, would choose this moment to leave the World Health Organization. I mean, this is appalling. I mean, for whatever you might say about the shortcomings of the World Health Organization, I don't say it's perfect, but the capacities for global cooperation, at least through traditional channels, have been shown to be very limited. At the same time, though, if you look behind the scenes, then you can see that there has been global cooperation amongst centers of disease control, for example. Informal global cooperation. So they have not relied on the formal channels of the WHO, but they've found other informal channels of cooperation. And I think you see global collaboration, exchange of information and experiences between cities. Because cities are where a lot of the great outbreaks of the pandemic have been and concentrated. So the cities have something to say to each other, not necessarily the national governments. So I think if you look at some of the things that are unfolding, the global cooperation amongst the pharmaceutical companies, I mean, this vaccine and the way it has come out, and the scientific collaborations. So there are alternative forms of global cooperation which perhaps we can learn from in this pandemic experience and improve upon for the future.
Okay. Thank you. Now I think I know some panelists still have questions, but I think we have discussed this for like 90 minutes. It just goes like time flies like that. We only have like 30 minutes left. So now I would like to address the question from participants. For the first participant, I want to invite Januar Pratama to address the question in person to Professor Scholte. Please, Januar, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
Can we see your face, please?
Seems like I cannot turn on the camera.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, Professor, I have found an interesting take regarding the quite unique relationship between Indonesians and globalization. In a survey done by YouGov in 2016, it has been found that 72% of Indonesians believe that globalization is a force of good. However, 78% of Indonesians also believe that Indonesia must be self-reliant, and only 12% saw immigration in a positive light. What is your opinion regarding this love-hate relationship between Indonesians and globalization? And how could such a paradoxical stance happen? Thank you, Professor.
If I could figure out this one, I would be a very wise person, wouldn't I? No, it shows the contradictions in people's inclinations in many ways. Those are really interesting. Those are really interesting findings. I think you're right that that many people are torn. I would be interested to see how this questionnaire was put together. Did they ask these questions immediately, one following the other? Or did they ask one question and then they asked a number of other questions and then they asked the next question, so that these questions were not set next to each other, but were, and what kind of questions came between the first question and the second question, if you see what I mean. So what might have influenced people's thinking as they moved through the questionnaire. But I can't see that, so I wouldn't know. You have to be very careful in the construction of surveys anyway, in terms of the kinds of responses that you can get because of the very way that you construct the survey. But leaving that aside, I think it is certainly true that people do have paradoxical reactions. That on the one hand, they see positive connections, they love their internet connections, they love their, I don't know, their global films, they love the diversity of food and clothing and the like that might come through global connections. And then at the same time, they feel that their language is under threat, or they feel that their cherished cultures and faiths and so on are under threat. They feel that their nation state is no longer able to be in control, and that they therefore don't have democratic control. That their local environment is being degraded by global ecological changes, and then then they're anti. Then they see the anti part of the global. So it goes both ways. The favor of, or the lack of the opposition to immigration falls into that pattern of defining an in-group and defining a we, and then setting that we up against an external they, and feeling that infringement of that they into the space of the we is somehow threatening. Of course, historically, the history of humanity has been about movement of people. All of our ancestors were in Africa, and all of us are migrants at some point, because we all moved from Africa to different parts of the planet. And most of us, if you look at parts of our families within 1 or 2 generations, there are people who have migrated. So in a way, yeah, you can be against immigration, but migration is part of the human condition. If we could move to an alternative identity politics, which wasn't reliant on an us being defined in territorial terms and in opposition to an external they, if we could develop different identity politics, we would probably get out of this kind of syndrome of regarding immigration in this way. But that is asking people to change their social consciousness in a very fundamental way, which I don't see happening quickly, sadly.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. The next, I think I would like to invite Rahmat Sharif, to ask a question. Sharif question I choose because it I think represents so many other questions that still thinks that we should treat globalization more as structure than consciousness. So this is one of example. Sharif, are you ready? Sharif?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting to present the questions by myself directly like this. But anyway, thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I have a questions regarding the current economic globalization. We have seen in the recent years the rising of protectionism and economic unilateralism. We have seen that from the recent trade war between the U.S. and China, or the withdrawal of the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we can mention many other examples. What does it mean for the contemporary economic globalization, Professor? Does it signify a deglobalization, or does it actually represent something else? Can we still be optimistic in the neoliberal globalization? What do you think, Professor? Because there are so many discussions that we are now in the process of deglobalization economically. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, no, very good question. I mean, there's always there has been for centuries tension between, on the one hand, liberalism and liberalization in the international economy, and protectionism, economic nationalism, mercantilism on the other hand. And those two visions and those two policy paradigms have been in competition for 400 years. Well before Adam Smith even. So I don't imagine that competition between protectionism and liberalism is going to go away anytime soon. We've seen assertions of protectionism from both the right and the left on the political spectrum in relation to contemporary globalization for a long time. The so-called anti-globalization movement of the 1990s, its opposition to the multilateral agreement on investment, its opposition to the liberalizing World Trade Organization 20 years ago was strong. There were very strong liberal and, as you called them, neoliberal forces at the same time. And in the 1980s, there wasn't much of a protectionist reaction or backlash to them in the 1980s. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was. Then it receded some. Now, in recent years, we have had the assertions of the Bolsonaros and Trumps and so on of the world. But it looks like Trump, well, who knows what happens in the United States these days? But let's take it as what we're told, that Trump probably leaves the White House either under police escort or voluntarily in January.
I hope so. I hope so.
But many of the things that you're mentioning, Ahmad, are related to a particular government and a particular person and a particular. I and colleagues did a survey of elite opinions towards globalization and global governance between 2017 and 2019. And we interviewed elites in business, in academia, in civil society, in the media, in political parties, amongst politicians, and in government bureaucracies. So we interviewed elites, people who are taking decisions, people who are policy related, in South Africa, Russia, Brazil, Germany, United States, and Philippines. And our findings were that, you know, behind the Dutertes and the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Putins of the world, in fact, these elites were very open to global connections, and they were very open to global level policymaking. These elites actually gave preference to the global level of policymaking above the national level of policymaking in relation to human rights, in relation to economic development, in relation to trade, in relation, I'm forgetting anyway, but it was 5 or 6 policy areas, important policy areas, where these elites preferred the global level of policy to the national level of policy. Well, this is not protectionist at all. So I wouldn't, there's protectionist noise, and there is liberal noise, and the protectionist noise has been more higher volume in recent years, but I'm doubtful that we've seen a really fundamental structural shift in people's opinions. I was talking about elite opinion, note here, yeah? And Januar was talking earlier about the 12%, you know, in a public opinion survey. So publics might have greater protectionist impulses than elites. That certainly may be true. And in other research that I and colleagues have done, we have found that there is far greater citizen skepticism towards globalization than elites. But the elites tend to take the decisions.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Next question, I would like to invite Rizka Alivia Rahma. You can deliver your question directly. Are you there, Rizka?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, Rizka.
Yes, I can. You're very clear.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for the very insightful presentation. My name is Rizka from the International Relations of Leiden University. I would like to ask a question about how globalization influenced the development of the Global South, seeing the differences and dependency of the countries. I see that project like eco-risk reduction of UNEP evolved because of the globalization. And does that mean that globalization gives any encouragement for sustainable development in the Global South? Thank you.
Okay, good. That's a complicated question. A good question and an important question, but a complicated question. it's a very complicated question because I would say Global South is a very large category.
Yeah.
It covers many countries in many different situations. So how does globalization influence the Global South in terms of Indonesia? That's one thing. How does globalization influence the Global South in terms of Bolivia? That may not be the same thing. How does globalization influence the Global South in terms of China, Ghana, Korea? Anyway, so I think there's a lot of differentiation there. There's also, you know, if you say it's also not only which country in the Global South, but also which people. So, you know, how does globalization influence women in the Global South? How does globalization influence young people in the Global South? How does globalization influence wealthy people in the Global South? Again, this can vary. How does globalization influence English speakers? Well, globalization probably gives a lot more power and resources to English speakers. The hegemonic language. You know, we are speaking it now. Sorry, I'm answering your question by saying that I think it's awfully complicated. It really depends on what you mean by Global South. Global South is, and you know, the North-South category is important because it points out one of the important axes, one of the important hierarchies in contemporary world politics. But like most binaries, north-south, man-woman, black-white, young-old, it's quite a simplification and an oversimplification. So it brings out something, but it also covers over a lot of diversities and differences. So I'm not sure that I can give you a clear answer that covers the whole Global South.
Yeah. How about in general?
In general, in general. Well, I mean, you know, those countries and people and groups that have tapped into global value chains and global capitalism more generally have benefited a lot. Sometimes just for themselves personally, sometimes for, you know, larger groups around them, and sometimes for countries as a whole. But at the same time, that tapping into global capitalism has not worked very well for many other people. And as I said earlier, the inequalities that have come out of that are enormous. And when I said, you know, that there is this 0.7% of people who are owning 45.3% of the world's wealth, that includes a number of people in the Global South. It's not just Global North people who are part of that 0.7%. You know, it's also oligarchs in Russia, and I suspect it's also some of the very wealthy families in Indonesia. So that's not a North-South divide, that's a class divide.
Okay.
Yeah. So those binary doesn't really work in this globalized world, right? It's more, we have to see, we have to dig deeper.
Yeah, or Barbados, you mentioned post-colonial thinking and post-colonial theory, or feminist theory, I would say here also. Ideas about intersectionality, that you don't just look at hierarchies in globalized world politics only on one dimension. So on the one hand, we have a hierarchy that's north-south, but we also have a gender hierarchy in world politics. And we also have racial hierarchies in world politics. We have age hierarchies in world politics. We have religious hierarchies in world politics. We have hierarchies of ability and disability in world politics. We have hierarchies of sexuality in world politics. There are many hierarchies, and a person's experience of the global world in terms of whether they are empowered or whether they are subordinated tends to be substantially shaped by where they sit on the intersection of those various hierarchies. So someone who is in the global north, but is a person of color, is a woman, is a young person, and living with disabilities, they might be in the global north, but in the overall picture of things, they're actually quite subordinated. And likewise, someone in the global south who is otherwise situated in a wealthy class, in a dominant ethnic group, in middle age, a man, and so on. I mean, they may actually, in spite of being in the global south, in the overall picture of things, be in quite a strong position. So I think usually I find that looking only at gender or only at race or only at this is too simplified, and the power relations in the global world are really about the intersection, the combination of these different hierarchies.
Thank you. Now, like we have 9 minutes left. I think it is not. There will be something wrong if we discuss globalization within the study of IR without really talk about state sovereignty, right? It's a major concept we have in IR studies. Like so many questions asking about relations within like globalization and state sovereignty. If we see globalization as a material things, as a structure, as a system, as a mechanism, it is easy for us to understand that globalization is actually reducing state sovereignty. But if we try to see globalization more as some immaterial things, you still hear me? Can you still hear me?
Yeah. I'm thinking hard. Now you are frozen.
Yeah, I'm back now, I hope. Yeah.
Your voice is back. Your picture is not, but the voice is the important part.
Yeah, the most important. Now at this point, the most important thing is the voice. The face is not important. Yeah. So if we try to understand globalization more as an immaterial thing, such as consciousness, how can we understand the relations between globalization and state sovereignty?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a tricky one as well, isn't it? What do we mean by sovereignty? If by sovereignty we mean that a particular location of power has absolute, comprehensive, unilateral, and supreme control. So absolute means it's not qualified. Comprehensive means it covers all issues, areas, and so on. Unilateral means that it's just the state by itself that has the power, and supreme meaning there's no higher power above the sovereign. If sovereignty means that a particular power has absolute, comprehensive, unilateral, supreme control, then different sites have been invested with sovereignty over history. People have said that God has sovereignty. People have said that the monarch, the king or the queen, has sovereignty. And then in modern times, people have said that the nation state has sovereignty, has this absolute, comprehensive, unilateral, supreme control. Well, when it comes to global relations, the state doesn't, in material terms, have that control. That's what we're getting at here. State sovereignty is embedded in the assumption of a territorial world. And a global world is in good part super-territorial. So the state cannot have unilateral, by itself, control over relations that are largely outside its territory. And it cannot have supreme control when there are other bodies, regional and global, which might be having power as well. So state sovereignty in that material sense, in a global world, it doesn't exist. It probably never really fully existed anyway, but it's certainly not there now. But to say that there is no state sovereignty in a material sense is not to say that there's no state power, because states can have a lot of power without being sovereign. They can have a lot of power when they work with other states. They can have a lot of impact on something even if they don't have the final say. So state power is still very strong, even if state sovereignty is a myth. But then getting to the other part of your question, the myth is also real. So the discourse of sovereignty, the mindset of sovereignty, thinking about sovereignty, that is still very strong and still holds very strongly for people. So many people are expecting or wanting state sovereignty. And that invests the state with a lot of power, because people are looking to the state as part of their autonomy, as part of their self-determination, as part of their identity. And when they use this word sovereignty, it's a lot about feeling that they have control over their lives, they have control over their identities, and so on. So if you then tell people your state has lost sovereignty, well, then they feel that they've lost some of their identity, they've lost some of who they are, and they react against this hugely. And they feel that some of their democracy and autonomy is taken away from them. So the discourse, the talk and the language of sovereignty is very powerful still. It has a very strong influence for many people, And in that respect, sovereignty is very alive. So it's very alive in people's heads, even if it's not very alive by a strict definition in the material practices of states.
So, in conclusion, we don't need to really worry that the so-called globalization is actually threatening sovereignty.
Well, I don't know whether it might remake sovereignty. As I say, sovereignty in modern times has been invested in the state and in the nation state, but at other times, sovereignty has been invested in God, has been invested in monarchs. You know, the divine right of kings in Europe, the sovereign was the king, it wasn't the state, it was the monarch that was the sovereign. The sovereign has been the church or in Western Christianity. So the sovereign has been in different places besides the state. So we may continue to have sovereignty, but maybe in the future, thinking back to what the earlier question about the historical context and so on, the sovereignty may be invested in something other than the state in the future.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 minutes left. I want to collect some of the questions into one. So what do you think now the relations between globalizations and some global norms like global warming, human rights, global governance? So the new norms that so far we take it as yes, it is global norms, but it is Western norms that is imposed to us through globalization. Right. So how you expand relations between globalizations and the spread of the so-called global norms?
No, there are norms in the sense of values, standards, principles that people refer to in order to judge behavior and to judge conditions. And they become global to the extent that they are followed and applied across the planet and in relations between people across the planet. Defining those norms, deciding what those norms will be, is a political process and a political struggle, and it's affected by power relations, absolutely. So the norms that become the norms tend to reflect power relations at a particular moment in time. So many of the norms that you point to are coming from dominant sides. The norm of sovereignty is a European norm, actually. It derives from the European system, the European notion about God and state and church and so on. And it has globalized. So curiously, when people in the global South are now shouting about the norm of sovereignty, they're actually applying a Western norm. But then they're using it against the West, which is again, this is all fascinating paradoxes of history. But and human rights, likewise, understand human rights. Again, they're coming out of certain places. But I imagine the global norms. I would hope, and I think in practice it also happens, that they do remain diverse in several senses. One is that a global norm may be understood and applied very differently depending on different contexts. So you might have a global norm about gender equality. But what gender equality means in the context of Indonesia, or what it means in the context of Uganda, or what it means in the context of the United States can be very different. So I think you can have a global norm of gender equality, just to take this example, but still express it and work it out very diversely depending on what gender equality means in different contexts. So it can be a global norm without necessarily being the same everywhere. But beyond that, I think one can also have global norms which might apply for some people across the planet, but not everyone. So, I mean, people of different religious faiths, for example, might have a global norm in the sense that it applies to everyone of that faith all over the planet. But that doesn't mean that it has to be a norm that applies to people who don't have that faith. So it can be a global norm, but it doesn't have to be a universal norm. So I think that this is also a point. The great challenge, it seems to me, for the future on these issues is how do we deal more constructively with the normative diversity and difference in the world, where the historical norm of a, if I can call it Eurocentric imperialist world, has been, here are the norms and everybody else is going to follow them. Can we move from that kind of unilateralist, assimilationist, imperialist way of dealing with global norms to a, what I would call, transculturalist way of dealing with global norms, or global conversations about norms, where there is a lot of respect and recognition of diversities and differences, where there is a lot of embracing of those diversities and differences, where there's a great consciousness of the power relations that are alive in cultural politics, where there's a lot of deep listening, where people really try to listen and understand where diverse positions are coming from, and where people are open to exchange and learn and change themselves through those conversations. That's a very different kind of cultural ethics, global cultural ethics, than we've known in the past. If we could move to that kind of transculturalist approach, I think the world would be a much happier place.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yes. Okay. We have run out of time now. I try to, at the beginning, I plan to make some conclusion, but I think it is too difficult to have like a summary or a conclusion. But maybe you want to have some words related to the discussion and the dialogue that we have this afternoon, like 2 hours, but it feels like half an hour. What do you think? Or do you have
This has been, for me, this has been, I would most like to hear from the students actually what they think, but for me this has been enormously stimulating, a lot of fun, challenging. I'm feeling tired. It's only the end of my morning as opposed to your afternoon, and you've already exhausted me with very challenging questions and very very precise and push me, and I really appreciate this. I really appreciate this.
Yeah. And I know that you have a very important meeting coming this afternoon, right? And I hope you still have. Yeah. Okay.
My very important meeting was to meet you this morning.
Oh, happy to hear that. Thank you so much. Okay. Before I end the session, we have Ibu Asra Virgianita, Professor Scholte. She is the head of postgraduate program in our department. So probably Bu Asra want to say something, please, Bu Asra.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Riris, Bu Riris. Prof. Jan, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm very happy to see you, and I think it's very interesting and important discussion with our students. And also, I'm learned much from you, what you say about globalization. So I hope for maybe for the future we can have another event, or maybe we can invite you again to have a lecture again, or maybe another research or another event. And thank you so much, and I hope you will we have a chance again to meet in the virtual or maybe face-to-face directly. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bu Riris. I think it's very good event and going smoothly. And thank you also for the attendance for the students, and also of course to our lecturer, Mbak Evi, Bu Nurul, Mas Syarif, and others. Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof. Jan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bu Asra. Yeah, okay. I don't know how to close the session, but probably I just want to say some words. I think, I mean, related to the topic, if you talk, the topic of the session is contemporary globalization, right? But listening to how you explain about globalization, I think there is no such contemporary globalization. I think every day is a contemporary globalization. Every day is a new globalization, because globalization is not structure. Globalization is not a mechanism. Globalization is something that we create in our mind. Globalization is something that related to how we deal, how we respond about things. So even at the very individual level, every day will be contemporary globalization. And with this, I think the message is that we need to be positive in seeing globalization, so that we can get the most of it. Yeah. So the message is be positive, be optimistic, and be open mind to always see change and new things. Yeah, I think it's really a new way to see globalization. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. I will still continue your work, continue following your work. Yes, probably I'm going to do my postdoc with you. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah. Thank you so much. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Rius. Thank you, everyone. That was
Thank
really
you.
nice.
We have participants from not all over Indonesia, but definitely outside Jakarta, and I think everyone get like very lucky to be to listen directly to you. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. I will close the session now. I'm sure everyone have learned a lot from the message, but if you still want to listen to this lecture again and again, you can go to IR department YouTube channel. It will be there soon after this. And then if you still, if you want to, have the PowerPoint from Professor Scholte, just email us. We will send the PowerPoint to you. Yeah. So thank you so much. I will close the session. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much.
Waalaikumsalam.
Yeah.